good afternoon or evening or morning, whichever time you're watching this episode of Can We Talk. Today's episode is a continuance of the first film that we did that you watched last month with Bob Tammen and his wife Patty, who is sitting over here watching us film. She's here with us but won't be part of this episode. And that's because Bob's going to need access to this map to show about water and mining in northern Minnesota and contaminants and different things. And we left off last month's episode talking about Bob's service in Vietnam and the difference between his outlook on what happened in Vietnam and our soldiers' involvement in Vietnam, as opposed to the local group here that are Vietnam vets who are so adamant that that they be venerated and that their service be venerated, and not being forthright about the damage that we did there. And not only the damage that we did to the Vietnamese people, to their country, to their environment, to their water, but also to our soldiers. I have met personally some Vietnam veterans, one in particular who lived west of town here, who was dying a few years back from Agent Orange complications. And there are many of those soldiers, and there are many here of those soldiers suffering from the results from our Agent Orange and other contaminants. War and bombs and the training for it all involve toxins, poisons of some sorts. So it amazes me that local people that are close to a military base, especially a live fire bombing military base as large as Camp Ripley, aren't more concerned about water contaminants, air contaminants, soil contaminants. It just amazes me that people gonna turn a blind eye to the whole thing because they have this false patriotism, this false image that our warring and everything that leads up to it is so grand, and it's not. It's horrible. So I'm gonna just let you talk about your time in Vietnam, and wherever that wants to go, that whole conversation. Let's just start with that.
Robin, being you mentioned Agent Orange, it takes me back to one of the first couple of days I was in Vietnam. Most of the time I was doing some kind of fire direction, and if you're doing fire direction, you're probably inside of a perimeter. Somebody else was pulling perimeter, but the first couple of days we hit there was confusion getting set up around Benoit, and I caught perimeter duty. So I'm out there at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm standing under a tree, and I'm looking up, and it's like a Halloween scene, what you'd see right now. You're looking up at that tree, there's not a single leaf on that tree. This is Vietnam, trees all got leaves on them. Mm-hmm. And there's not a single leaf on that tree. And it was just like a spooky Halloween scene. And that image stuck in my mind for years. And at the time, I had no idea that they were using Agent Orange. I don't think hardly any of us troops did. But as years went by...
Which is a defoliant, right?
A defoliant. So as years went by, all of a sudden I realized that I might have been exposed. And then, at first they said, no, nobody was exposed. Then the truth comes out, and that image came back to me, that Halloween scene, the tree with no leaves. And it was right out of Benoit Air Base. That area was heavily sprayed. And so there's no doubt most of us young soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange. And, I was interviewed a couple of years ago when they did that. Ken Burns did the story on public TV, and they did an interview with some of us veterans, and I told that story about the Agent Orange. And if people go to YouTube, I think if you type in Bob Tammen Vietnam, that little interview pops up there, and whoever edited did a nice little story. He showed images not just of me, but of the Air Force men that were handling at Agent Orange. They've got those barrels, so they probably got exposed to more than I did, those members of the Air Force. And so there's a lot of us floating around here. Uh, I suppose it depends how much you're exposed, your individual genetic makeup, because it does some genetic damage too. So, when they talk about wounded warriors, uh, there's a lot of our Vietnam vets are carrying around some of those wounds. And as far as those who have been through that Vietnam experience and still support our stupid foreign wars, I asked them, think of what we did. And I think of some instances, it doesn't have to be deliberate atrocities. One of our first confirmed kills in Vietnam was a 12-year-old Buddhist monk. And, I was doing fire direction for 105 artillery. You have 6 guns firing at once. And it's common that all 6 guns fire the same numbers. So your shells go out in a pattern, they land in the same pattern as the guns were positioned. And one round went astray and it killed that 12-year-old kid. That's a sad thing to take a human life. It's just even more tragic to kill a kid like that. And of course, this was in the early days of the Vietnam War. They didn't want bad publicity. They came down, they grabbed my papers I used for computing. They wanted to see who was at fault. Well, only one round went astray. That tells you one of the guns made a mistake. It's a complicated business. It's high stress. So maybe one man made a mistake and one kid died. Well, when you're in combat, a lot of people are making mistakes and a lot of kids are dying. And whether it's 105 artillery in Vietnam or drones in Afghanistan, we're killing kids. We're killing civilians. So it's not just the heroic combat soldiers are having glorious battle. It's the fact that we've got all these villagers, these civilians mixed up in a battle zone. We should be very hesitant to go in there with our massive firepower. And, our massive firepower gets turned against us. I remember Ford Observer calling back and saying, a 2.5 truck just disappeared. And of course we knew it was the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese. If we had a huge bomb that didn't go off, they'd bury it alongside the road and booby trap and blow up our trucks. And so our own firepower is turned back against us. So as I think about our massive firepower and how little we've accomplished with it in my lifetime, we've done more harm than good. I can't think of any good wars, whether it's Somalia or Yemen or Syria, where we're fishing in troubled waters. We've got our CIA in there, and our CIA is like a separate army out there. We should go back to having our diplomats do diplomacy and quit trying to solve all our problems with firepower.
Well, our massive wars and damage that are being done by that, and even our training exercises, it's killing the earth, and eventually all life will be lost because of this fixation that we have, this dependency on military might. It's gone rogue. It's crazy.
We're quite unprincipled, and I think of the things we used in Vietnam. You had white phosphorus, you had napalm. Those are wicked weapons, and I have.
That's even used at Camp Ripley now. Red phosphorus even, and it's in the range regulation of Camp Ripley. If you don't believe me, folks, look it up yourself. There are certain areas out there that they can't use white or red phosphorus in because of wetlands areas. Anything else is fair game. And white phosphorus is very caustic. Burns right through skin and bone, correct?
I have a minor disability, so I get 10% from the VA, but I get the Disabled American Veterans magazine. And a few years ago, I was reading my magazine, and towards the back of the magazine, it had a picture. It said something about a bomb in an Afghan village, and it had the photographer's name on it. And I thought, something looks bad about this picture. And what looked bad to me, you know, as a veteran, I know that you get that white smoke from a bomb or artillery, it's kind of a certain color. You get the white smoke from white phosphorus, it's white. It just stands out there how white it is. And I called that photographer, I said, that looks like white phosphorus. He said, well, actually it was. And that's a war crime because the picture was of a bomb going off in a village. You can't be dropping white phosphorus into villages and thinking that you're not a war criminal. So our government is still sending us out to do things that a decent human being should not do. And you look at the pictures of napalm, you know, there's that iconic picture of the burned girl running down the highway in Vietnam. I think it's burned in all of our minds. And you can see the village in the background. What are we doing dropping napalm on villages?
Well, we dropped two of the biggest bombs ever on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Completely war criminal.
That's true. And
And what did it accomplish? Killing civilians. What did that accomplish? You know, the Japanese didn't bomb a civilian city. They bombed a military base in Pearl Harbor, which is within war tactics. But to bomb a civilian city, a huge metropolitan area, two of them, in retaliation for what the Japanese did, how bizarre is that?
you know, you look at even the Second World War, they want to call it the good war, but we can't really ignore our history of colonialism one way or the other. You know, we colonized America, we had indigenous people here, and you know, the roots of the Second World War, all the European countries squabbling, trying to absorb more primitive countries, you might say, less developed countries. So it was a battle of colonial powers that just got completely out of hand. But it's something that we have a history here in America, and I think about that with our indigenous populations. Of course, where Pat and I live in Minnesota on the Iron Range is the 1854 treaty area. And so our tribes have hunting and gathering rights. If you look at this map of the Mesabi Iron Range, the 1854 treaty area runs, here's Hibbing, here's Virginia, the treaty area runs north and south through there. So where Pat and I live, we have, the tribes have treaty rights. They have the right, they retain the right to hunt and gather. And of course, I don't think you have a reservation real close here, but still, you are part of a treaty area here. When hostilities ceased, or maybe there were no real hostilities in this immediate area, but they signed a treaty before they gave up some of the rights to their land, but typically they use the same language in all of their treaties. And the language says, we retain the right to hunt and gather. And if you have friends on the reservation, they'll tell us white folks, you did not give us the right to hunt and gather. We always had those rights, we retained them. And so part of those rights is the right to have clean water. So when you see the white phosphorus going off at Camp Ripley, those tribes downstream have a right to their clean water. So you can't be polluting the water that are covered by treaties.
Interesting. Now, so from Vietnam, then after Vietnam, you were asked to go to, or made to go to Camp Ripley for training out there for summer camp. Talk a little bit about that.
You know, back when they had the draft, it was always, if you didn't want to get drafted, you could enlist for 3 years and maybe get to pick the kind of training you want. Or if you could join the National Guard. At that time, you probably wouldn't go to active duty if you joined the National Guard. You do 6 months of training, and then you go back to your home National Guard unit and not have to go to combat. So with the National Guard, at that time, you didn't see combat. But I just waited till I got drafted. I could see it was coming. I was 21 when I got drafted. And so I went through basic jump school, artillery school, and then Vietnam. And, I assumed when my 2 years was up, I was done. I'd done my duty. Well, the next summer, I got orders. And I think I was doing something in South Dakota at the time. And they sent me way over here to Camp Ripley. And so I had to leave my job and do 2 weeks of summer camp, which it was just an aggravation after I'd pulled my 2-year tour of duty. Then the next year, I got orders again. Now, by this time I'd met Pat and had taken a great interest in her, and here I got my orders to go to summer camp again. But this time I'm in northern Minnesota. They sent me out to the Badlands of South Dakota to go to summer camp. And so I did my second tour summer camp in the Badlands of South Dakota. But so that 2 years active duty, 2 years of summer camp, and then 2 more years, that's 6 years before you've satisfied your obligation to the United States of America. So, of course, after 2 years, I got some DD 214, they call the form. I think I got my honorable separation, but my obligation, my military obligation was not up until I'd spent 6 years. So it was, for a young man in my age group, the draft was something to contend with, and we all had choices to make. I made the choice to just wait for the draft to take me. There are other people I greatly admire that refused to be drafted. Some went to Canada. There are others that they choose not to go to Canada. They just refuse to be drafted. And some of them went to jail. They went to prison because of their principles. And thinking back to the history of where I grew up, in South Dakota we have a number of Hutterite colonies. You might have a few in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And going back to a little history during the First World War, now those Hutterites, they were peaceful people. They would not raise an arm against their fellow human beings. Mm-hmm. And so when they came to draft those Hutterites, they refused to put on a uniform, and a couple of them ended up being in prison. I believe they ended up in Alcatraz, some very tough prison conditions. They were abused badly to the extent they'd put them in unheated cells. I suppose they ended up with pneumonia. They died in prison. Those young men, and the one was married. They sent him back, his body back to his wife. They put a uniform on him before they sent him back. I don't know if they wanted to rub salt in her wounds, but I know the story is accurate because Pat and I went out to the Hutterite colony not far from where I was born. I asked if I could visit the cemetery and the graves of the martyrs, and they did an article in the South Dakota Magazine about the martyrs, and that some people wanted to put up a monument to their martyrdom, and the Hutterites said, we don't do things like that. And each grave had a little marker on it in that cemetery, mm-hmm. and the 2 martyrs had a little stainless steel plaque about a foot long, maybe 6 inches high, and mm-hmm. it just had their names and the word martyrs on it. Mm-hmm. But there are people that died rather than raise a hand against their fellow human being. And of course, we might wish for a world where everyone was like that, and but we're stuck with what we got. But I think we should respect our martyrs and realize that it is possible to live in peace. And the Hutterites, they have fairly prosperous colonies. Mm-hmm. So they've adapted, they use modern agriculture. Mm-hmm. It's not like the Amish who still do it with horses and mm-hmm. Don't use electricity. The Hutterites are very modern, but they are pacifists. They are nonviolent. Mm-hmm. Some of them leave the colony, but still I think they carry some of those attitudes with them, and I wish that more in our society would think that violence is a last resort mm-hmm. rather than the first thing.
And I'm suspecting, I agree with you, the probably part of the reason they're successful as a colony or a community is because they pull together. They don't fight amongst each other. They're not driven by competition to get ahead of their fellow man. They want to prosper as a group of people. Nobody's left behind, in other words.
That's
so
true.
it's a form of a cooperative. It's sort of like a form of socialism
You know, it
where
truly
you don't
is.
leave anybody out.
You know, another thing interesting about the Hutterites, I think as soon as the colony gets to a certain size, they'll split off and send off a daughter colony to start a colony in another spot. And I don't know what the number is to where it gets, where you lose that cohesion. I want to say around 400 members, but I don't know that for a fact. It might be more or less. But, you know, the Hutterites in South Dakota, when their two young men were martyred, they left that colony and went to Canada. And, you know, those Hutterites that went to Canada, they never did come back. Another group of Hutterites came in and bought up the colony, so there's still a Hutterite colony on that site, but it's not the ones that were there during the First World War.
That's interesting.
Yes, it is, that people will stick to their principles, so
Well, that is, after all, the example that Christ set.
turn the other cheek. And I think about that. You know, as a young man, as I mentioned, my mother was a good Catholic. Of course, my dad was Protestant, so there was a little contention: do I go to parochial school or out to the country school close to where we lived? So I did go to 1 year of parochial school. You know, you have to make your first communion and do the other Catholic ceremonies to get confirmed. But part of my education, I suppose, was being exposed to different religions. I had an aunt that was a Benedictine nun, an uncle that's a Presbyterian minister. So you're exposed to those currents, and you still see that your values matter. And I don't quite understand, even looking at my own life, you know, if I studied my catechism, I was taught to turn the other cheek. But when the draft board called, I went willingly to be a soldier. And I wonder how we can get our young people to think twice about whether they want to be a soldier or not.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Bob, because I was just getting ready to ask you to suggest that now's your chance. There are undoubtedly some young people that are going to be watching this. Some high schoolers, junior high schoolers, young people in the community will see this film. And I should have taken more time to interview more of the Vets for Peace that had come from the Metro and all over the day of the Camp Ripley protest that was September of 2019. But what would you tell a young man or woman from here in the Little Falls, Morrison County area, reasons not to join the military? And then when you get done with that, I don't want to forget about this. I want to talk a little bit about how you deal with when people want to thank you for your service. How do you answer that? But tell the young people or their parents, give them a little bit of advice based on all of your knowledge and your travel through the military machine as to what they should choose or not choose.
You know, you bring up a good point about how do you react when someone thanks you for your service. And, you know, usually I nod politely because I don't want to go into, it's probably not a situation where you go into a big discussion. No, but I'd want to tell them about that 12-year-old kid, that 12-year-old Buddhist monk that we blew away by accident. That's what happens in the military. You're going out there with lethal weapons, and they're going to be used, and you're going to make mistakes. You know, we live in a society that can use our talents, whether it's cleaning up the water in our community, being active in politics, and even though I'm not a religious person at this stage of my life, I think our churches need input from real peaceful people. That's a part of our, even if I don't have a Christian religion, I still grew up in a Christian culture, and I remember that about turning the other cheek and loving your neighbor as yourself. And really, most of the major religions feel that way in one way or another. They talk about the violence of Muslims. Well, the Muslims have children and grandchildren, and they love their children and grandchildren just like the rest of us do.
Certainly.
And so, how to respect those values that are life nurturing rather than the ones that our military wants to teach us. And the military has to teach you to kill. It's really, even people that are a little on the belligerent side, still there's that idea that you don't want to hurt your fellow human being, but when you go through basic training, they still, when I was going through, they gave you bayonet training. Mm-hmm. And you fix your bayonet and you stand out there and you're pretending you're going after the diabolical enemy, and you stab at the imaginary enemy, and then the drill sergeant says, "What is the spirit of the bayonet fighter?" And you answer, "To kill." And that's it. You're taught that your spirit is to kill. And that's against our human nature. Mm-hmm. And it may not be perfectly obvious, but empathy is a part of a normal human being. Mm-hmm. If you're around somebody that's happy, it kind of cheers you up a little bit. If you're around somebody that's going through a period of suffering, you identify with their suffering. And I think most normal human beings are that way. But there are exceptions for one way or reason or another. And I look now, we have a president who thinks it's comical to think up insulting nicknames for people who disagree with them. And I think back to my father's words. He said, "I like to get along with the neighbors." And it didn't matter what those neighbors believed as far as religion or politics. If my dad had a way to be on good terms with them, he would go out of his way to do that. Mm-hmm. Not that he was completely mild-mannered. He had maybe a little bit of a temper, but still, he controlled it. He was on good terms with his neighbors. And that's what we should be doing with our young people. Just take the normal human empathy that they're born with and nurture it instead of trying to turn them into soldiers.
And so for the poor students that go to Little Falls High School, or maybe Uppsala, or Bolus, or Royalton, or Pierce, the outlying cities around here, that have no hope of a college education, maybe not even a vocational degree, without going into the military, because that economic tease of the military saying, "We'll pay for your college, we'll pay for your education, we'll give you health benefits, we'll give you a discount on your food," whatever it is, all these enticements that the military uses. What advice would you give them about finding a different path, perhaps in teaching, like Pat, made her way? There are other ways and other things to choose. How would you suggest a young person, navigate that economic stumbling block of not being able to afford a good education, to take a different path other than going in the military?
I'd think about young people that it's a real challenge. If you graduate from high school, I say dive into our economic system enthusiastically, do the best you can. Back when I was a young person still in high school, we still had a blacksmith shop in town. They weren't shoeing horses anymore, but they still had the old forges, and they'd sharpen the plow lathes and the big hammer to put a sharp edge on them, and they had the barrel full of water to temper them and everything, and a lot of welding going on there. And so I'd go into town with my dad, and I'd watch that blacksmith at work, and I'd see him welding, and I thought, boy, that'd be fun to be a welder. Maybe welding isn't the best paying job on earth, but it pays decent wages. And so one way or another, I learned how to weld in my younger days. And of course, I went on to get electrical training. I had a master electrician's license in Minnesota, but still, sometimes electricians do their own welding, and I was good enough that I ended up welding aluminum for power companies. And I think there's an example of something I did it because I loved it. And I didn't make my living in my earlier days from welding, but as the years went by, all of a sudden I had some skills that fit in someplace. And so, there's no certainty in our economic system. It can be tough sometimes, but dive in, get the best job you can. If you're enthused about something, study it. I never borrowed money to go to college, but I managed to get a decent education. And I know it's tougher for the young people now, but there's jobs out there. Go and do the best you can. As far as I see from military, I don't think they have a very high completion rate for people that go to military and then go back to college. So I'd suggest that develop some good financial habits. My dad grew up during the Depression. And as far as he was concerned, all debt was bad, whether it was government or him personally. And he didn't have a lot of debt during his life. And so to the extent that you can, don't be loading your credit card up with debt. Pay attention in school. Learn what compound interest does for you or to you, depending on which side of the equation you're on. And so I go back to my dad's example. Be moderate in your spending habits. So for a young person to come out of school now, I'm glad I'm at the stage of life I am now, even though it wasn't all real easy, but perhaps get involved in politics. We need a level playing field. You can't have a level playing field when one of the players starts out with millions of dollars or billions, and the rest of us have to go out for minimum wage. And even as a young man, I was maybe working for the neighbors for $1 an hour. Well, $1 an hour wasn't too bad of money those many years ago. So in addition to getting a decent job, you ought to be thinking about getting a decent society. You should be telling our legislators that you want a decent minimum wage and decent employment laws, so we don't have these employers stealing their employers' paychecks, and we know they do it. The meat packing plant in southern Minnesota, they'd have an employer work 40 hours for the company, then they'd flip them over to a contractor, and they'd work another 20 for the contractor, so they wouldn't show that they worked overtime hours for the company. And of course, they finally caught up with them, but that's the kind of things many of our employers will do. So we have to have a legislature that'll protect our vulnerable citizens.
And so I like your suggestion of the young people when they're first starting out to pay attention and contact their legislators, and even as soon as you're able to, consider running for office, because young people are the future of this country. And rather than, when we go to protest vigils and other activities that we go to for similar reasons, we see a lot of this gray hair. The young people just aren't there. And I know it's in part because they're struggling to get their feet on the ground and put food on their table and provide a roof over their head and pay for their car insurance and all the rest of the things that it takes to live a comfortable life. But if young people did, from the beginning of their life, put more into their activism, we'd have a different world. I'll never forget, when I was early in my floral career, I moved to Jacksonville, Florida for a period of time. And it was there before I moved back home to Minnesota that I really wanted to be an environmental activist. But I had no idea how to get into that. And I got inspired because I went to a Sierra Club, several meetings of theirs. And so, but I had been a lifetime florist to that point. I studied it up in Brainerd College, and I was fairly good at what I did, and I enjoyed my vocation. But this tug on my heart, and I was only 19 probably then, maybe maybe 20, barely, that there was this environmental thing. And that was tugging at my heart early. And the reason I didn't get into that is because I had no clue how to do that. And I think, in essence, I probably wanted to do that for a living. And I didn't know how to do that. I also considered, before I moved home, driving a truck. Because I would then be able to, I was wanting to go to 18-wheeler training. I looked into the schools, and I had identified a couple of them that I was seriously considering, because it would have paid me a lot more money, and I could have seen America. So that's my experience as a young person. I never did go into that activism back then. I moved home and I started my first business. Did go into a little bit of debt, took a $5,000 loan, took a job at the state hospital that paid that debt off within a year. I had it paid. And my first store was a health food store, first in the area that I lived in, combined with dried flowers. And because there were no silk flowers back then, but dried flowers and wood fiber flowers. But so there are alternatives to, I could have just as easily have thought about service in the Peace Corps, because some of the people that I was around were thinking of that. So there's different ways to see the world and get an education. You can even mentor under someone if you can find that opportunity. I've thought a lot about recently, one of the things, because I trained 2 of my kids in floral really pretty well. And one of them took that to the highest degree and did really, really well with her career in that. She got health complications now, so that sort of stifled it. But if you can find an older person that was willing to mentor you in the skill that they learned, now, granted, some of the accreditation maybe wouldn't be there, but you can at least begin to get a feel for that career by doing that. I told my children as they were growing up, in the back of the store that I ran, I can't afford to pay a college education for you, but I can teach you to be a really good florist. And if I was physically more able to right now, because I have my own health complications right now, I would find it very gratifying to teach one or more young people the floral industry, because I know it inside and out.
You think of the opportunities that pop up and the paths that you take. Pat and I have been clean water people all our lives, I guess, but we hadn't done much at the legislature and didn't really know how the system worked. You read the papers and that's about it. But I don't know, over 10 years ago, there was going to be a hearing at the Capitol on mining. And one of the environmental organizations, it might have been the Sierra Club, knew that I'd worked in the mines and spoke up for clean water. So they'd asked if I would testify at the hearing. And of course, I was happy to do it. But that experience got me into a hearing room, and I realized how the committee system is set up, finally figured it out. And I realized that, I don't necessarily need to have an environmental organization send me down to the Capitol. I can go down there myself. And Pat and I do go down there once in a while. And, these hearings, they're not all the same, but every now and then the chairman of the committee will say, does anyone from the audience have anything to say? And once in a while it's an issue where I'm informed, and I'll go up to the microphone and give them my 5 minutes of opinion. And, I can't see that I've changed the course of history, but I've given them the viewpoint of a miner in northern Minnesota that cares about clean water and thinks they could be doing things better. And I would say that to the young people in Little Falls. The adults in the room are not doing things as good as they could be doing it. They could use a little encouragement from a younger generation. And so usually every week I go, when the legislature's in session, I go and call up the committee meetings. And if there's something that looks like Pat and I are informed about it, or we have a dog in that fight, we'll go down and sit through that committee meeting. It's a good test of your patience, because a lot of it is posturing, political where they're going to vote party line no matter what. But once in a while, you can change a vote. On rare occasions, I've been able to do that. And so that's what keeps you going. And of course, it's not all committee meetings. You're going to see your legislators down there. Once in a while, you can pin them down and give them the elevator speech. You know, that's the old term for if you're with your legislator in an elevator for 2 minutes, what would you say? They want you to be ready to have that in your head, how you'd quick give them a message. And so sometimes I try to say that, you know, we don't always have an hour to exchange our ideas and opinions. Sometimes we got 2 minutes. And so you think about that 2 minutes. How do you put all your values on clean water into 2 minutes? But it might make a difference. Another guy and I went into a hearing on fugitive emissions. That's the emissions in a mine that come off with the trucks and stuff. It's not going out the stack, it's just what they've stirred up through normal operations.
It escapes.
Yeah. And so we made our points, and we knew which way the vote was heading, party line, and we flipped a couple of them. And, you know, it helps to be part of the community. The fugitive emissions vote was about mining, and I said, you know, we have problems in northern Minnesota with our mining. A lot of our miners are dying from lung diseases, mesothelioma, and I said, I know it's true because I go to the funerals. And maybe that resonated with them, I don't know. But you got them to vote down that crappy bill. So it's not easy. There's a lot of big money flying around the Capitol, but you know, sometimes little people can have as much influence as big money, and that's what us little people have to do, keep pushing on the levers of power if we have a little chance.
If there were more masses of people and young people all the way up to the elderly doing that, we could turn this nation around.
You know, I think about the student loan rip-off. You know, it's very difficult to go bankrupt on a student loan. You got people retiring trying to cope with their student loan debt. And so we live in a system that pampers the super rich and takes advantage of the poorer people. And I think about the things that can go wrong. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was in Virginia, Minnesota. I was standing in line for something, and next to a lady roughly my age, we were talking about mining. And she said, you know, Erie Mining Company went bankrupt in 2001, and she was telling me her husband died the same year. He had been an employee, and she said when that company went bankrupt, my husband died, I started out looking at having $2,000 a month pension from that company, and it went to $200. She said, 90% of my pension went away. So there was that 74-year-old lady, she was going back to work because all she had was Social Security and that $200 a month, which even on the Iron Range where living is a little more economical, it's tough. So,
well, that's poverty level living.
that's, you know, it's a sad society that people aren't responsive to our students and to our old people, that they're shoveling money up to the billionaire ranks and leaving the rest of our communities struggling behind.
And that happens because people are willing to vote against their pocketbook, which is insanity.
Yeah, it's hard to figure sometime the people that have voted against their own interest. And we have a global financial system. Of course, the United States has considerable power over it, but not complete power. And, you know, we've gone through the collapse in 2007, 8, and 9. So we've seen what can go wrong. And it looks like we're kind of in a little bit of a situation again where we could have a little blow up. I don't know if you pay attention to the financial thingies, but maybe a month ago, they have what they call overnight rate. If the big banks need a pile of money to have proper reserves overnight, they have to go out in the market and borrow it. Well, something went wrong with the money floating around the system. I think the rate floated up to 10% for overnight loans. And I'm thinking there's a lot of senior citizens with passbook savings or something like that. They'd love to get 10% on their savings. But here we are, the savings rate for those of us who are retired, if you want to throw it into something, treasury bonds or something like that, which are relatively safe in the United States of America, they're all under 3%, 2%. So we have an economic system that doesn't make it as easy as it should be for those of us in our golden years to have just a steady income. And we're not trying to get rich. We just want to pay the bills and have a little extra go out on Friday night.
Well, I think we should talk a little bit about the two books you have here.
Okay.
And then we're down to almost teaser time here. The hour's just about gone.
It is.
We probably have less than 15 minutes left. Bob's expertise is in this area with the mining, and I told you folks earlier in the interview, the first interview that we did with Bob and Pat, that they have been involved in the move against polymet for 14 years or more. And so let's talk a little bit about this now, and then the last hour that we film, which will be aired the month after you're watching this, folks, that last episode then will be focusing on polymet and why it's important that we all, regardless of political side, err on the side of being against polymet. My father was a railroad engineer, and he showed me what happens when you strike a fusee. They're made up of the solution that drips out from a railroad fusee is sulfuric acid.
Oh, yeah?
And then it burns through skin and bone. It's an extremely caustic material. And I can't remember how my father demonstrated that, but he showed us, dripped it on something to show that it burned through. And I don't remember what it was when I was a kid, but boy, I paid attention. I learned from that. Sulfuric acid is what's created anytime the water hits the copper nickel mine area. The ground that's left, or the minerals that are left there, when water hits that, sulfuric acid is created, and that goes then into our rivers and water system, drain, sewer system, all of it. So it's important that people pay attention to what Bob has to say about this and why we should all be opposed to copper and nickel mining anywhere in our state, but especially in that area that provides most of the water that we enjoy for recreational purposes, our shipping and everything else. It's important. So
I'll start out by just, you can't see the fine detail on the map, but the big picture is in the color code that I got on this map. And I'll point out the features here. Now, this disturbed area going from southwest to northeast, that's the Mesabi Iron Range, is continuous mining for 100 miles from Grand Rapids down here in the southwest to Ely, Minnesota in northeast. And now, Robin mentioned the water. The red line on this map, that's the watershed divides. This is the Laurentian going up this way. They call this the St. Lawrence divide coming down this way. But they come together here. I put a red dot on the map near Hibbing, Minnesota. That's where the three watersheds divide there near Hibbing. And that's an important spot, because from that spot, if a drop of water, a drop of rain falls there, it can go north, Hudson's Bay. It can go south into the St. Louis River, Lake Superior, or around this way into the Mississippi River drainage. So we've got mines leaking into all three major watersheds.
Wow.
And even though iron mining is not near as hazardous as copper mining, that water coming off of these tailings ponds is degraded.
So I didn't know that. So some of the chemical contaminants from up in the Hibbing area, and like you said, the taconite mines and so on, is actually coming down and getting in our Mississippi River.
Mississippi River drainage.
Wow.
Yeah, so you've got a dog in this fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and these pink areas along the map here are tailings ponds. And all those tailings ponds are leaking. Every one of the taconite tailings ponds on Mesabi Iron Range are leaking. They build the
Wow.
dikes with coarse tailings, so it's not.
And a tailing is what now?
That's what's the tailings is what's left over waste rock out of the iron mines.
So it's actual rocks.
It's rock that's
How
been
big?
ground.
How big are the rocks?
Okay. They start out with solid rock. They grind it on down, dry crushing. Then they run it into a rod mill with water. When it comes out of that rod mill, it might be a quarter inch or less.
Like a pea rock.
Yeah, it's pretty coarse. But they can do a magnetic separation at that coarse grind. So they have horizontal drums, 10 feet long at least, 3 or 4 feet in diameter. There's various sizes depending on the engineering. So they have magnets hanging in that drum. So the slurry goes under the drum. If there's iron in it, it'll stick to that drum because of the magnet inside. The drum is rotating. When it rotates away from the magnet, the stuff with iron falls off onto another belt. The stuff that does not have enough iron in it to stick to the drum, that's coarse tailings.
Oh, that's the tailings.
That's,
Okay.
so now this ore body, iron is roughly 25% ore, so it's 75% waste. So
A lot of tailings.
lot of tailings, and a lot of it is coarse tailings. So it's pretty easy to take those coarse tailings and make your dams out of it, make your dikes out of it. The dike that blew up, I think in Brazil not too
Yep.
long ago, killed batches of people. That was a dike just like we have. Same construction method. So, and like I said, it's not clay, it's not impermeable, so water is seeping out of that dike all the way around.
I was going to say these are rocks. They're not stuck together with cement or something. So what's to prevent the water from leaching out of there?
It leaches. It leaks.
Oh, my
In the
word.
case of the plant where I worked at the most, Mintac, it's leaking roughly 4 million gallons a day.
So why in the world aren't our safeguards set up so that they have to have like a rubberized liner or something to prevent the leakage like they do out of the dump here in Morrison County?
It's because of the point I'll make, our ore bodies are not globally competitive. They're low-grade ore bodies. So if we force them to do it right, they're broke. They can't afford to do it right. We keep giving them exceptions, so they can't afford not to leak at this stage, or at least they tell us that. So,
Not paying their top dogs $3-4 million a year.
yeah, so we're stuck with, right now we have half a dozen operating taconite plants on the range. Every one of those tailings ponds is leaking. So we're stuck with that degraded water coming into our 3 major watersheds.
And these are not small at
Okay.
all. About how many miles across is that?
I'll use Mintac for an example. That's approximately 4 miles across.
Like that big, folks.
4 miles across.
Wow.
Now, that's not
4
a
miles.
that's not a perfect square. So that tailings pond is 13 square miles,
Wow.
and it leaks into the Lake Vermilion, and it's leaking into the Dark River. Now, the Dark River is a trout stream, so they're trying to get Mintac to clean up their leaking tailings pond there. But once again, it's pretty pricey, and that's why I would urge the state of Minnesota to start working on a transition away from mining. Our existing mines cannot afford to do it right. If they had some miraculous technology where they could clean up that water at a reasonable price, but you know, as I understand it, all we got now is reverse osmosis, very expensive. They'll use that on maybe on a copper mine or a gold mine. On an iron mine, which we have here existing on the Mesabi Iron Range, they can't afford to do that.
What's in the water inside those tailings ponds?
The geology along the 100-mile length of the range varies quite a bit. So what's in the water depends on the local geology. And one of the big ones now is sulfates. And that's important because of wild rice. Now we have some fairly decent science that tells us when sulfates get over 10 milligrams per liter in wild rice waters, you're going to start killing that wild rice. But the chemistry is complicated. And the way it works is if you have sulfate in the wild rice in the water, and there's organic material, that organic material pulls the oxygen off the sulfate, changes it to a sulfide, and that's what kills the rice. So usually rice is growing in peat-type water, mucky bottom. Wild rice likes a mucky bottom. So it's very common to have sulfates change to sulfides and kill that wild rice. We have a 140-mile dead zone for wild rice in the St. Louis River. And my argument is that we shouldn't be permitting these copper mines until we figured out a way to clean up the iron mines good enough to restore our wild rice in the St. Louis River. But they haven't done that yet.
But so my reason for asking that question, what goes into the tailings ponds is not clean water. It's water that has residue in from the mining, right?
And it's recycled. So when I worked at Mintac, I actually drove out. There's a dike around here. There's a pump here on the east side of that tailings pond. They recirculate that water through many times. And what happens, the final grind, the coarse grind is like quarter inch or less. The final grind is the consistency of face powder. So those minerals, whatever you have in your ore body, is getting dissolved in that water and circulated through the plant again and again. So after several trips through, that water is really getting mineralized. And the mining company says, we're having trouble making good quality pellets out of that water that's been circulated through so many times. We want to dump more of it into your public waters. And this was the case at Mintac where I worked. They wanted to dump another 7 million gallons a day. First they proposed Lake Vermilion, then there was opposition. They proposed the St. Louis River, and we fought that off. And so they're still not dumping that water, but my idea is they don't care that much about the leakage because they're getting rid of that heavily mineralized water so they can pull in more clean water for their process. So their argument was that the water was too dirty to make good pellets, but was clean enough to dump into the St. Louis River.
Wow. And we only have about a minute left, so I'm going to let you wrap it up. Maybe you want to mention your books here?
Well,
Or do you want to start the next episode with
how
that?
about we start the next episode
Okay.
and I'll read to you a little bit.
That sounds good. And this has been really interesting as a lead-in to the next segment, which will be pretty much 100% about this. The other thing I want to talk about to do with water is Camp Ripley's contaminated water and how it got that way. And so please watch the next segment, the next hour that we'll be filming real shortly here. And thanks again, Bob and Pat, for coming down all the way from Sudan, right?
Well, I'm always eager for a chance to read to you, Robin.
And thanks to our viewers for watching. We hope you'll watch the next segment too. Thanks, and we'll see you next time at Can We Talk?